she thought she was protecting her son from a gold digger. But when Margaret forced her daughter-in-law to divorce him over a simple hug with a pizza delivery guy, she had no idea that humble delivery driver was actually a secret billionaire running a multi-million-dollar empire from the shadows. What happened next would make Margaret's blood run cold and cost her family everything they never knew they almost had. This is the story of how one mother-in-law's snap judgment destroyed the connection to a fortune hiding in plain sight, and the shocking moment the truth finally came crashing down. Margaret Hale had never believed evil looked dramatic. In her experience, destruction wore sensible shoes and spoke in calm, reasonable tones. She sat in her car across the street from her son's house, engine running, watching through the open front door. She told herself she was only stopping by because she'd been nearby. That lie made it easier to justify why she was already watching so closely. Emily moved through the living room with an ease Margaret had never liked. Too comfortable, too unguarded. Emily laughed as she balanced a pizza box in her hands, shifting her weight when the delivery driver apologized again for the late order. The man was young, forgettable, the kind of person Margaret's eyes usually slid right past. Then Emily leaned forward. The hug was quick, polite, almost awkward. Margaret's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She didn't gasp. She didn't feel shock. She felt permission. She waited, watched the delivery driver leave, made sure the door was still open. Moments mattered. Timing mattered. Then she stepped out of the car. Emily saw her immediately. "Oh, Margaret, I didn't know you were coming." Margaret stepped inside without answering, her gaze sweeping the room like an inspection. The pizza, the open door, the faint smell of grease and warmth. "I saw you," Margaret said calmly. Emily frowned. "Saw what?" Margaret turned slowly. "Don't insult me by pretending." A thin line of unease slid into Emily's stomach. "It was just a delivery. They brought the wrong order. And you hugged him," Margaret said. "Yes," Emily replied. "I was saying thank you." Margaret smiled small, tight, practiced. "You don't hug strange men in your doorway when you're married." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the front door opened again. Daniel stepped inside, loosening his tie, already tired from work. He stopped when he sensed the air had changed. "What's going on?" Margaret turned to him immediately, her tone softening as if a switch had been flipped. "I didn't want to upset you, sweetheart, but I would never forgive myself if I didn't tell you what I just witnessed." Emily's heart began to pound. "She hugged another man," Margaret said. "Right here. No hesitation." "That's not what happened," Emily said quickly. "Daniel, please." Margaret raised a finger without looking at her. "Let him look at you." Emily froze. Daniel looked at her face, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Doubt crept in, not because Emily looked guilty, but because Margaret sounded so certain. "It was just a thank you hug," Emily said, forcing steadiness. "That's all. Make weight." Margaret reached into her purse. She pulled out her phone. "I took pictures," she said. Emily stared at her. "You were watching us?" Margaret ignored the question and handed the phone to Daniel. The photos were framed carefully, cropped, zoomed. The hug looked longer than it was, closer, more intimate. Margaret hadn't waited for proof. She had created it. Daniel stared at the screen longer than Emily could bear. "I warned you," Margaret said softly. "This is how disrespect begins. Small boundaries crossed, innocent explanations, and then one day you realize the woman you married never respected you." "That's not fair," Daniel said, but his voice didn't carry weight. Emily felt dizzy. She reached for the back of a chair without thinking. "You okay?" Daniel asked, distracted. Emily swallowed. "I just haven't been feeling well lately." Margaret noticed that. She always noticed weakness. Emily pressed a hand lightly to her abdomen, a subconscious gesture she hadn't shared with anyone yet, not even Daniel. She had planned to tell him soon, on a good day, a safe day. Margaret watched the motion with narrowed eyes. Interesting. Over the next days, the atmosphere in the house changed. Margaret called Daniel every morning. She sent him articles about emotional cheating. She reminded him how his father had trusted the wrong woman and lost everything. Every doubt was framed as protection. Every accusation as concern. Emily tried to defend herself. She explained. She showed messages. She suggested counseling. Margaret dismissed it all. Manipulators love therapy. It gives them better words. 13. The stress began to settle into Emily's body. She woke nauseous, exhausted. Her emotions felt raw, close to the surface. She told herself it was anxiety. She didn't want to give Margaret anything else to weaponize. One evening, as Daniel and Margaret argued quietly in the kitchen, Emily sat alone on the couch, hands resting protectively over her stomach. She whispered, barely audible, "Just hold on." Margaret saw that too. Within weeks, the divorce papers arrived. Margaret chose the lawyer. Margaret paid the retainer. Margaret sat beside Daniel in court, holding his hand while Emily stood alone, pale and shaking. No one noticed when Emily had to sit down halfway through the proceedings. No one but Margaret. Outside the courthouse, Emily paused, breathing carefully, fighting the wave of dizziness that rolled through her body. Across the street, a man stood arguing quietly into his phone about delayed shipments. The delivery driver, Lucas. He looked up just in time to see Emily press a hand to her stomach and wince. He didn't know why. But something about the way she stood, fragile and stubborn at the same time, lodged itself in his memory, and Margaret, watching from a distance, felt a cold sense of victory. She had no idea what she'd just set in motion. Emily learned something new about fear in the weeks after the divorce filing. Fear wasn't loud. It didn't scream or explode or arrive all at once. Fear arrived in envelopes. The first one came on a Monday morning. Thick paper. Official seal. The kind of mail that made your stomach tighten before you even opened it. Emily stood in her kitchen holding it while her coffee cooled untouched on the counter. She already knew it wasn't good news. It never was anymore. Additional hearings. She sank into a chair slowly, as if moving too fast might make everything worse. Her hand drifted to her stomach without thinking, fingers resting there protectively. The nausea had been constant lately. The fatigue unbearable. She told herself it was stress, that it didn't mean anything yet, that she could wait. Across town, Margaret Hale smiled when the lawyer confirmed the papers had been delivered. "Rush divorces create mistakes," Margaret had said calmly. "We want everything very clear." The courthouse was cold the day of the hearing. Emily sat beside her attorney, back straight, hands folded, determined not to look as small as she felt. Daniel sat across the aisle with Margaret beside him, her hand resting lightly but possessively on his arm. Margaret wore gray, soft, respectable, the uniform of concern. When the judge entered, Margaret lowered her gaze, as if burdened by sadness rather than satisfaction. "We're here regarding continued proceedings in Hale versus Hale," the judge said. Margaret's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to raise a concern." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. "Our client believes Miss Hale has been exhibiting unstable behavior," the lawyer continued. "Emotional volatility, poor judgment." Emily's attorney objected immediately, but Margaret dabbed her eyes with a tissue, the picture of reluctant honesty. "I'm just worried," Margaret said softly. "She's been under so much stress." Emily felt heat rush to her face, her hands clenched under the table. She looked at Daniel, waiting, hoping for him to say something. He stared at the surface of the desk. The judge sighed. "What are you requesting?" "A psychological evaluation," the lawyer replied. Out of an abundance of caution, Emily turned to Daniel. "You know this isn't true." He didn't look up. The gavel struck. Granted. The sound echoed in Emily's ears long after the courtroom emptied. Outside, she barely made it to the wall, before bending over, nausea crashing through her violently. She breathed shallowly, fighting the urge to be sick, right there in the hallway. Margaret passed by moments later, heels clicking calmly against the tile. She paused, just long enough to take in the sight of Emily hunched and shaking. For a brief moment, curiosity flickered across her face. Then she turned to Daniel and murmured, "See? Unstable." Emily heard her. That night, Emily threw up until there was nothing left in her stomach. Her body shook with it, muscles cramping, head pounding. When she finally lay down, a deep, unfamiliar pressure settled low in her abdomen. 2 days later, HR called. Emily sat in a small, glass-walled conference room while the manager folded their hands carefully on the table. "We've been informed about ongoing legal matters," the manager said. "There are concerns about reliability." "I've never missed a deadline," Emily said quietly. "We're not questioning your performance," the manager replied. "But perception matters." Emily nodded. That phrase again. Always before something was taken away. "We're placing you on unpaid leave until things resolve." Emily thanked them, because she had learned that gratitude softened the blow for everyone except herself. She cried in her car afterward, silent, shaking sobs that left her exhausted and hollow. Halfway through, cramps curled through her abdomen, dull, persistent, frightening. She pressed her hands there and whispered, "Please, not now." Lucas found her like that, forehead resting against the steering wheel. He didn't speak at first. He waited. "She's doing this on purpose," Emily said eventually. "Every time I try to breathe, she tightens the grip." Lucas nodded. "She wants you worn down. People don't fight well when they're tired." "I don't have anything left," Emily said. He drove her home and stayed, not hovering, not fixing, just present. That weekend, Margaret hosted dinner. Daniel's colleagues, old friends, carefully chosen guests. Emily's name came up naturally, the way poison always did when disguised as concern. "It's been such a difficult time," Margaret said, shaking her head. "Some people just don't handle pressure well." Sympathetic murmurs followed. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Margaret squeezed his hand beneath the table. "We're doing everything we can to help her," Margaret added gently. Across town, Emily lay awake, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other clutching her phone. She typed a message to Daniel, then deleted it. The pain worsened overnight. By morning, Emily was pale and sweating, cramps twisting sharply now, fear blooming fast and uncontrollable. Lucas took her to the hospital without waiting for her to argue. The doctor spoke carefully, eyes kind but serious. "You're under extreme stress," she said. "That's dangerous in early pregnancy." Emily's breath caught. "So you can tell?" "Yes." Emily closed her eyes. "There is still a heartbeat," the doctor continued. "But you need rest. No stress. None." Emily laughed softly, tears sliding down into her hair. Outside the room, Lucas stood very still, fury tightening his chest. At home, Margaret reviewed notes from her lawyer, sipping tea. She smiled. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. She didn't know she had already gone too far. For 3 days after the hospital visit, Emily did exactly what the doctor told her to do. She stayed in bed. She turned off her phone. She let Lucas handle the outside world. It felt unnatural, this stillness, but also fragile, like holding a glass ornament with both hands, terrified that even breathing too hard might shatter it. The cramps had dulled, not disappeared, but enough to give her hope. False, dangerous hope. Lucas brought her water, soup, quiet reassurance. "There's still time," he said gently. "You heard the doctor." Emily nodded, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. "I just need to get through this. If I can get through this, I can protect it." She didn't say the baby. Saying it out loud felt like tempting fate. Across town, Margaret Hale found out anyway. She learned the way she always did, through people. Daniel mentioned it accidentally over dinner, his voice low, uncertain. Emily was at the hospital. The doctor said stress was dangerous. Margaret paused mid-bite. "At the hospital?" she repeated carefully. Daniel nodded. "They said she's pregnant." The word landed between them. Margaret set her fork down slowly. Something sharp flickered behind her eyes, not shock, not concern, but calculation. "How unfortunate," she said after a moment. "Given her condition." Daniel frowned. "Condition?" Margaret reached across the table and patted his hand. Emotional instability, sweetheart. Pregnancy amplifies that. You don't want to be pulled back into chaos. Daniel hesitated. The doctor said stress could. Margaret cut him off smoothly. Doctors always say things like that. It doesn't mean you should put your life on hold. That night, Margaret made a decision. The next morning, Emily's phone buzzed, despite being on silent. Lucas checked it and felt his jaw tighten. Another court notice. Emergency hearing. Same judge. Same courthouse. Emily's heart began to race the moment Lucas told her. I can't go, she said, panic rising. I physically can't. Lucas read the notice again. They're claiming financial concealment. They're accusing you of fraud. That's insane, Emily whispered. I don't even have money to conceal. Lucas looked at her carefully. This isn't about winning. It's about breaking you. Emily shook her head, tears gathering. She knows. She has to know. Lucas didn't answer. His silence told her everything. The courthouse felt even colder this time. Emily walked slowly, every step deliberate, her body heavy and uncooperative. Lucas stayed close, ready to catch her if she stumbled. People stared. Whispers followed. Margaret was already seated. She looked directly at Emily's stomach, just once. Then she smiled. The hearing began. Margaret's lawyer spoke with crisp confidence, laying out allegations with surgical precision. Fraud, deception, manipulation. Every word sharpened for maximum damage. Margaret dabbed her eyes again. I tried to protect my son, she said softly. But some people don't know when to stop. Emily's vision swam. Her lawyer objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed the statements to continue. Then Daniel stood. Emily's breath caught. I trusted her, he said, voice tight, and she betrayed that trust. Emily stared at him, disbelief hollowing her out. Daniel, please. He didn't look at her. Margaret watched calmly, hands folded. Emily felt the first sharp pain then, not dull, not distant, immediate. She gasped, gripping the edge of the table. Lucas rose instantly. She needs a break, he said firmly. She's pregnant, the doctor warned. Margaret's lawyer spoke over him. Miss Hale requested this hearing. She is clearly capable of continuing. Margaret didn't object. The pain intensified, ripping through Emily's lower abdomen. She bent forward, breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. Heat spread, followed by something terrifyingly wet. No, Emily whispered. No, no, no. Lucas was beside her now. We're leaving, the judge frowned. Miss Hale, Emily didn't hear the rest. Her knees buckled. She collapsed. The room erupted, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, someone shouting for help. Lucas caught her before her head hit the floor, hands already stained red. Margaret stood slowly. For the first time, something like unease crossed her face. Not regret, not guilt, just the sudden awareness that this had gone further than she intended. As paramedics rushed in, Lucas looked up at Margaret. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Margaret understood something she had never considered before. That some people don't forgive, they remember. Emily didn't feel the floor when she fell. 1 second she was upright, the courtroom spinning, Lucas's voice cutting through the noise, and the next, darkness swallowed everything. Sound returned in fragments. Shouting, chairs scraping back, someone calling her name again and again, as if repetition alone could keep her alive. Lucas was on the ground beside her before anyone else moved. Emily, stay with me. Look at me, he said, his voice tight, controlled only by force of will. She couldn't answer. Pain tore through her lower body, sharp and consuming, followed by a warmth she didn't need explained. Lucas pulled off his jacket and pressed it against her instinctively, his hands shaking despite his effort to stay steady. Help is coming, he said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. A few feet away, Margaret stood frozen. For the first time, the room wasn't bending around her. Paramedics forced their way through the crowd moments later. Commands were barked. Emily was lifted onto a stretcher, ceiling lights flashing past her as she was rushed out of the courtroom. Lucas climbed into the ambulance without asking. The doors slammed shut. The siren screamed. Inside, everything moved too fast. Blood pressure cuffs tightened. Oxygen pressed against Emily's face. The medic's voice was calm but urgent. "How far along?" "Early," Lucas said. "Any trauma?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "All of it." Emily drifted in and out, consciousness slipping like water through her fingers. Lucas held her hand the entire time, refusing to let go, even when told to move. At the hospital, doors burst open. Pregnant female. Severe stress response. Heavy bleeding. A paramedic called out. Emily was rushed away. Lucas was left standing alone in the hallway, his hands still stained red. Time lost shape. When Emily finally woke, it was to the sound of machines. A steady, rhythmic beeping. Too calm, too controlled. The kind of sound that meant decisions had already been made without her. Her throat was dry. Her body felt hollow, lighter in a way that sent panic crashing through her before thought could catch up. She tried to move her hand. Lucas's fingers closed around hers instantly. "Hey," he said softly. "You're here." Her eyes searched his face, frantic. "The baby?" Lucas didn't answer right away. That pause was everything. The doctor came in moments later, her expression practiced but tired, eyes carrying the weight of words she had delivered too many times. "I'm so sorry," she said gently. "The stress triggered complications we couldn't stop." Emily stared at the ceiling, the beeping growing unbearably loud. "I warned you," the doctor continued, not accusing, just factual. "This level of emotional trauma is catastrophic in early pregnancy." Emily let out a sound that was almost a laugh. She knew. The doctor hesitated. "Who?" Emily closed her eyes. "Never mind." Lucas felt something settle into place inside him. Not grief that would come later. This was colder, sharper. A line crossed so clearly it could never be uncrossed. In the hallway, Daniel arrived too late. He saw Lucas first, his blood-stained hands, his hollow stare, and understood before anyone spoke. A nurse approached carefully. "Are you family?" Daniel nodded, his mouth opening and closing uselessly. "Is she?" The nurse's expression answered him. Daniel slid down against the wall, the sound he made raw and unguarded. Margaret arrived an hour later. She moved briskly through the corridor, chin lifted, grief already arranged on her face. When she saw Daniel on the bench, she sat beside him and pulled him close. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured. "I came as soon as I heard." Daniel looked up at her, eyes red, empty. She lost it. Margaret inhaled slowly. "These things happen," she said, "especially when emotions are unstable." Daniel stared at her. "What did you say?" Margaret touched his arm. "I'm just saying, we shouldn't jump to blame." He stood abruptly, stepping away from her hand. "She begged me to stop. She told me the doctor warned her. You told me it was drama." Margaret's mouth tightened. "I was protecting you." "No," Daniel said, voice breaking. "You were protecting control." Inside the room, Emily finally turned her head toward Lucas. "I don't want to fight anymore," she said quietly. "Not the pain. Her." Lucas nodded once. "Then don't." "I will." What followed didn't look like revenge. It looked like order. By morning, Margaret's world began to fracture. The law firm representing Daniel withdrew without explanation. A board Margaret chaired announced an emergency vote without notifying her. A longtime partner returned her call with a tremor in his voice. "I can't be associated with this," he said. "The optics are dangerous." "What optics?" Margaret snapped. "You should check the news." Lucas hadn't planned to make it public. Margaret had. Her whispers, her insinuations, her pressure after medical warnings. All Lucas did was remove the filter. Emails surfaced, verified, time-stamped, showing Margaret pushing for hearings after being informed of medical risk. A sworn statement from Emily's doctor followed. Then recordings. By noon, the headline was everywhere. Legal pressure linked to pregnancy loss in high-profile divorce. Margaret watched the screen in silence as her phone slipped from her hand. Daniel stood in the doorway. "Did you know?" he asked. Margaret swallowed. I didn't think. You knew, Daniel said. You just didn't care. He walked out. At the hospital, Emily signed discharge papers with steady hands. When the nurse asked if she wanted family notified, Emily shook her head. I have who I need, she said. Lucas stood beside her, unwavering. Margaret arrived later, stopped by security before she reached the room. She's asked that you not be allowed inside, the guard said. Margaret argued, threatened, demanded. No one moved. Across the hall, Lucas met her gaze. You did this, Margaret hissed. Lucas's voice was calm. No, you did. I just refused to hide it. For the first time, Margaret had no answer. And as Emily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Lucas made a quiet call. Not to a lawyer. To a doctor. We're planning for a future, he said. And this time, nothing touches her. We're planning for a future, Lucas said into the phone. And this time, nothing touches her. He ended the call without waiting for confirmation. The promise had already been made. The machinery to keep it had already begun turning. Behind him, the city breathed in muted light, unaware that several quiet decisions had just rearranged its balance. Emily slept. Not the shallow, restless sleep she'd been trapped in for weeks, but something deeper, her breath even, her face unguarded. The machines beside her hummed softly, no longer alarming, just present. Lucas stood by the bed and watched her chest rise and fall, committing the rhythm to memory. He had learned the hard way that peace was fragile, and that memory was a form of armor. Recovery took time, but not the kind people expected. Emily's body healed steadily, responding to care the way it was meant to when not under siege. Emotionally, however, the damage moved more slowly. Some mornings she woke with tears already forming, the courtroom replaying itself without permission. Other days, numbness settled in like fog, making hours disappear. Lucas never rushed her through either state. He drove her to appointments, handled conversations she couldn't face yet, and stayed silent when silence was the only language that didn't hurt. That was how trust grew, not dramatically, but reliably. Margaret Hale's world, by contrast, began to shrink in measurable increments. The emergency board vote she hadn't been invited to replaced her within hours. Partners she'd known for decades adopted careful distance, citing optics and timing. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. The influence she had cultivated through pressure and fear proved brittle once light touched it. Daniel moved out 2 weeks after the hospital incident. He packed quietly, without arguments or speeches, dismantling the life he'd lived inside his mother's shadow piece by piece. At the door, Margaret reached for him out of habit, more than hope. I did everything for you, she said. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the sentence for the first time. That's the problem, he replied, and closed the door behind him. It did not open again. Emily found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning that felt ordinary, until it wasn't. She stared at the test in disbelief, fear rising faster than joy. The memory of blood and pain surfaced immediately, sharp and uninvited, and she sank to the bathroom floor before her legs could give out completely. Lucas found her there minutes later, the result clutched in her hand. I can't do that again, she said, her voice small despite the resolve underneath it. Lucas knelt in front of her and waited until she nodded before touching her. You won't, he said. It wasn't reassurance. It was certainty. This time unfolded differently. Doctors who answered calls immediately. Appointments arranged around her needs rather than her availability. A home that felt safe because it was designed to be quiet, guarded, and unintrusive. There were no court notices, no envelopes thick with threat, no voices questioning her reality. When Margaret tried once, just once, with a carefully worded letter that apologized without admitting fault, Emily read it, folded it, and handed it to Lucas. Burn it, she said. He did. The pregnancy progressed cautiously, marked by vigilance rather than panic. Emily flinched at every unfamiliar sensation, every twinge that reminded her of what she'd lost. But Lucas learned the shape of her fear and met it without amplifying it. When the doctor turned the ultrasound screen toward them and smiled, Emily almost looked away, bracing for disappointment. Then she heard it. 2 heartbeats. She stared at the screen, breath caught. As the realization settled, "Wait," she said. "What?" "Twins," the doctor confirmed. "Strong. Healthy." Emily laughed and cried at the same time, covering her mouth as if afraid sound alone might undo the moment. Lucas closed his eyes, something loosening in his chest for the first time since the courtroom. The future, which had felt theoretical for so long, suddenly had weight. Margaret learned about the twins through gossip. A former friend mentioned it casually, unaware of the damage the words would do. Margaret smiled, nodded, excused herself, and went home, where she sat alone for hours, staring at an old photograph of Daniel as a child. The alert came later, lighting up her phone with a headline she could no longer ignore, one that mentioned Lucas Reed, not as a delivery driver, but as a financier, a quiet architect behind firms now moving openly. Understanding arrived late, cold and precise. She finally saw what she had pushed away. Emily gave birth on a calm morning washed in sunlight. 2 cries filled the room, overlapping and insistent. Lucas held one child in each arm, tears streaking freely down his face, unconcerned with witnesses. Emily watched him from the bed, exhausted and whole in a way she hadn't believed possible. "We did it," she whispered. "Yes," Lucas replied. "And no one took it from you." Outside the room, a nurse stopped Margaret at the desk. "I'm sorry," she said firmly. "You're not on the approved list." Margaret stood there in silence as laughter drifted down the hall from a room she would never enter. That night, after the twins slept and Emily finally rested, Lucas stepped onto the balcony and answered a call. He listened, said little, and then spoke with quiet finality. "This isn't revenge," he said. "It's accountability, and it's just beginning." He ended the call and looked back through the glass at the life he had chosen to protect. Behind him, the city stretched wide and waiting, and somewhere within it, Margaret Hale was learning that consequences do not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive patient, permanent, and impossible to undo.